3 years ago, almost to this very day, Bournemouth lost 9-0 away at Liverpool. 3 days later, manager Scott Parker was sacked. It was the joint heaviest defeat of the Premier League era, and quite possibly the most despondent. Bournemouth had conceded 16 goals in their last 3 matches, failing to score any in return. In his post-match press conference, Scott Parker described Bournemouth, in what was their first season back in the Premier League since getting relegated under Eddie Howe, as being, quote, under-equipped at this level. It had been a quiet transfer window for the Cherries following promotion from the Championship, and Parker didn't mince his words when it came to the strength of his squad, stating that the 9-0 scoreline reflected where Bournemouth were as a club and as a squad, that they weren't competitive, and that he had been fearful about what lay ahead throughout all of pre-season. It felt as though he was begging to be sacked, and Bournemouth's owners duly obliged. Parker was replaced by his first-team coach, Gary O'Neill, who had never managed before and only had 2 years of coaching experience. The bookies made Bournemouth odds-on favourites to finish bottom of the Premier League table, and few people gave them even the faintest hope of survival. In the 3 years since then, Bournemouth have not only avoided relegation, they have finished 15th, 12th and 9th. They beat Man City, Man United and Tottenham last season. They did the double over an Arsenal team that only lost 4 games all season. They inflicted Newcastle with their heaviest home defeat in 3 years, and they thrashed Champions League hopefuls Nottingham Forest 5-0. Following the sale of their top scorer Dominic Solanke last summer, the Bournemouth squad was even more heavily depleted in the window just gone, with the likes of Dean Huyson, Milos Kerkez, and Ilya Zabani's moves to Real Madrid, Liverpool and PSG, a reflection both of how far Bournemouth have come, but also the challenge ahead of them this season. But Bournemouth have won 2 out of their opening 3 games before the international break, overcoming Wolves and halting Tottenham's impressive start, with their only defeat coming away at Liverpool, where they gave the reigning champions an almighty scare. It's a remarkable turnaround in an extremely short amount of time, from a club that very nearly died in the late 2000s and who are, by most metrics, probably the smallest to have ever played in the Premier League. Yet whereas Brighton and Brentford's meteoric rises in recent years, their owners' pioneering software tools, and their data-driven recruitment models have been very well documented, and are, broadly speaking, fairly well understood, far less is known and has been written about how Bournemouth have gone from whipping boys to European contenders in barely the blink of an eye. It can only mean one thing. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to Bournemouth, a resort town on England's south coast which is probably best known for hosting 9 Beatles concerts, being the birthplace of Guglielmo Marconi's radio, and the final resting place of the author Mary Shelley, as we take a look at a football club that is making waves right now, the monster that Andoni Iraola has created, and how every little thing has come together for Bournemouth over the last 3 years, and why they just keep getting better all the time. It's no great secret that Bournemouth aren't the biggest club in the Premier League. In fact, they are almost certainly the smallest. Dean Court, with a capacity of 11,307, is the smallest stadium in the Premier League and the second smallest of the Premier League era, only very narrowly ahead of Kenilworth Road's 10,265 capacity for Luton Town's single season back in the top flight. It is over 1/3 smaller than the next smallest ground, the Brentford Community Stadium, at 17,250, and whereas Brentford's new stadium only opened in 2020, Bournemouth have called Dean Court home for the last 115 years. For 100 of those years, Bournemouth competed outside the top 2 tiers of the English game. Founded as Boscombe, which is a suburb of Bournemouth home to about 20,000 people, the club was renamed Bournemouth and Boscombe Athletic in an effort to be more representative of the local area in 1923. The same year, the club was elected to the Football League for the first time, becoming members of the newly expanded 3rd Division South. It would be almost 50 years until Bournemouth and Boscombe first tasted promotion within the Football League, in the 1970-71 season as 4th Division runners-up, and even that was only following relegation the previous season. It was after regaining their 3rd tier status that Bournemouth and Boscombe Athletic were renamed AFC Bournemouth. Unlike the AFC that appears in a lot of English football clubs' names, typically deployed as a suffix rather than a prefix, such as Huddersfield Town AFC, Hull City AFC, or Swansea City AFC, the AFC in Bournemouth's name isn't short for Association Football Club, so as to distinguish them from a local rugby football club at the time, nor, as is sometimes wrongly claimed, Athletic Football Club, but rather, much like the S in American President Harry S. Truman's name, the AFC in AFC Bournemouth doesn't stand for anything. It was just a clever trick by Bournemouth to ensure that their name would appear at the top of alphabetically ordered lists of English football clubs, above Arsenal and Aston Villa, ensuring that they would always be top of their respective leagues before a ball had been kicked. No, I am being deadly serious. Two other sneaky teams, AFC Oldham Aston and AFC Blackpool, would appear ahead of Bournemouth alphabetically, but thankfully for the Cherries, they are both in the 10th tier of English football and are unlikely to be in the same league as them anytime soon. The early 70s was a defining period for Bournemouth, who not only got a new name but also a new kit and colours, red and black stripes inspired by AC Milan, a new nickname, the Cherries, likely due to their new colours, and a new badge, which is one of the more unusual within the English game, displaying a silhouette of former player Dickie Dowsett heading the ball, with the club's new red and black stripes in the background. AFC Bournemouth's new name might have put them top of the league before a ball had been kicked, but they rarely stayed there throughout the season. In 1975, the Cherries were relegated again, and they developed a reputation for yo-yoing between the 3rd and 4th tiers of the English game, which was only temporarily halted by a period of success under Harry Redknapp. In his first job in senior management, which spanned 9 years, Redknapp took Bournemouth into the 2nd tier for the first time in the history of the club. He masterminded victory against Manchester United in the FA Cup, and won the inaugural Associate Members' Cup. In the summer of 1990, following relegation back to the 3rd tier, Bournemouth's managing director Brian Tyler died in a car crash while in Italy watching the World Cup. Harry Redknapp was in the car with Tyler but survived the crash, but 2 years later he left the club. The 1990s were a brutal period for Bournemouth, not only because of Tyler's death and Redknapp's departure, but primarily due to the weight of crippling debts, which very nearly killed the club. The Cherries entered administration in 1997, owing £350,000 to HMRC, or the Inland Revenue as it was then, and with debts of £4.5 million in total. Donations from supporters kept the club alive, but the underlying debts remained. And in 2008, the Cherries found themselves back in administration. Jeff Mostyn provided the funds to keep the club alive before a new ownership group, headed by Eddie Mitchell, who became Bournemouth chairman, took control of the club. A controversial figure, Mitchell infamously told Bournemouth supporters who disagree with his management style to, quote, "Go and support Southampton." He confronted his own supporters following a 3-0 defeat against Chesterfield, and shortly after he sold his remaining shares and stepped down as chairman in 2013, he claimed to have received a lifetime ban from attending the club's matches. Mitchell died in 2024, but despite his divisive character and behaviour, no one can doubt the groundwork that he laid for the success that was to come at Dean Court. Cash-strapped, the Cherries had appointed club legend Eddie Howe, who had only just turned 31 at the time, as their new head coach under Jeff Mostyn in December 2008, and he led the club to a great escape in League Two in his debut campaign, despite a 17-point deduction. Had Bournemouth gone down that season, there is every chance that they, or their Phoenix club, would still be a non-League One now, let alone a Premier League team. The two Eddies, Mitchell and Howe, guided Bournemouth to promotion in 2010, turning a sometimes fractured relationship into a winning combination, before Maxime Demin's takeover put supercharged behind the project in 2011. Described as a petrochemicals trader from close to the Russian border with Kazakhstan, Demin reportedly bought two £5 million houses in the UK in the early 2010s. One of them, in the affluent neighbourhood of Sandbanks in Dorset, not far from Bournemouth, he had knocked down and fully rebuilt. That is reportedly how he met Eddie Mitchell, who made his money as a Dorset property developer, when he contracted Mitchell to build his new house in Sandbanks. Before long, Demin was a shareholder, and Bournemouth were one of the wealthiest clubs in the English lower leagues. The opposite of Mitchell in many ways, who was outspoken and frequently made the headlines, in his more than 10 years involved with the club, Demi never gave a single interview with the English press. Rarely seen at Bournemouth matches, allegedly because he feared that his presence would bring the team bad luck, Demi's primary residence wasn't in the UK, but in tax-friendly Switzerland. Meanwhile, his UK company was based in the tax haven of Guernsey, a mere 90-mile swim from Bournemouth. FYI, I do not recommend swimming from Guernsey to Bournemouth. Eddie Howe had departed in early 2011, taking a job at Burnley in the Championship before Deming's investment, but he was lured back to his boyhood club less than 2 years later. With Howe's man management and tactical nous, and Deming's resources, Bournemouth won promotion to the Championship in 2013, and they didn't stick around for long. In their second season back in the second tier, and only their fifth season at that level in the entire history of the club, Bournemouth won promotion to the Premier League as Championship title winners, finishing above parachute payment clubs like Norwich, Cardiff and Fulham, along with clubs with much more illustrious and storied past than them, like Nottingham Forest, Sheffield Wednesday and Leeds United. Bournemouth competing in the Premier League is a prospect that few people, either inside or outside of the club, ever thought possible, and 10 years later, the novelty still hasn't worn off. It is true to say that Bournemouth's rise, from League 2 to the Premier League in only 6 years, wasn't a pure fairy tale. In the season that Bournemouth won Premier League promotion, 2014-15, they broke Championship spending and loss limits by a reported £10.9 million, and they spent a truly astonishing 237% of their turnover on wages. No other team spent over 180% of their revenue on wages that season, and Bournemouth also had the Championship's highest wage bill, excluding the parachute clubs. That was partly because of promotion bonuses, worth an estimated £5 to £6 million, but even without that, Bournemouth would still have had the highest wage to turnover percentage in the division, and the third highest wage bill outside of the parachute clubs, in addition to the second highest player amortisation costs outside of the parachute clubs, with among the lowest revenue in the division. Bournemouth were fined £7.6 million for their FFP breach, which was later reduced to £4.8 million upon appeal. Under ordinary circumstances, they would also have received a transfer embargo, but because they were promoted to the Premier League in the same season that they broke the rules, Bournemouth's transfer business fell outside of the EFL's jurisdiction. Nonetheless, whilst investment played a key role, the speed and style of Bournemouth's rise, with Eddie Howe's team winning promotion playing brilliant football, and sticking to their principles in the Premier League, was highly creditable. And other teams who have enjoyed similar or even greater levels of investment, as well as also breaking the rules, haven't enjoyed a fraction of their success. Eddie Howe's second stint as a manager at Dean Court came to an end in 2020, less than a week after Bournemouth's relegation from the Premier League was confirmed. Following a failed playoff campaign in a season which saw both Howe's assistant Jason Tindall and later Jonathan Woodgate take charge of the club, Bournemouth were once again promoted in their second season back in the Championship, this time as runners-up under Scott Parker. It is here, really, that I began this video, with Bournemouth's torrid start to the 2022-23 season, and that humiliating 9-0 defeat at Anfield 3 years ago. And I kid you not, there is a note in all caps next to this part of my notes about Bournemouth's rise and history prior to 2022, which just says, beat us. Look, I tried my best alright, a lot happened during that time, and there was a lot more that I had to leave out. Gary O'Neill got off to a good start at Bournemouth, which always helps, going unbeaten in his first 6 games in charge. O'Neill got Bournemouth organised, made them hard to beat, and utilised the team's pace on the break to make them an effective counter-attacking unit. As important as the tactical alterations, arguably, was the fact that he didn't tell anyone who'd listen at any given opportunity that his squad and players weren't good enough to compete at this level, which, again, you'd have to say, always helps. During the 2022 World Cup mid-season break, 5 days before the World Cup final in fact, Bournemouth's elusive Russian owner sold his shares in the club to an American consortium called Turquoise Bidco Limited. Since renamed Black Knight Football Club, American asset manager Bill Foley is the face of the ownership group and Bournemouth's largest individual shareholder. Though Foley is a lot more public-facing than Demine was, Bournemouth's new ownership structure is actually significantly more opaque. Black Knight Football Club UK Limited is a UK-based company, which is wholly owned by Black Knight Football Club US LP, which is based in Foley's native Nevada, and Black Knight Football Club US LP is partly owned by Canny Holdings, which is an investment firm founded by Foley, which is floated on the New York Stock Exchange, meaning that it is owned by a combination of institutional and retail investors. According to Canny's own filings in the US, BKFC owns 44% of Bournemouth, and Foley owns 7.7% of Canny. According to a recent article in The Athletic, Foley's total stake in Bournemouth stands at 28%, meaning that he owns a further 24.6% of the club, independent of his Canny shares. That still leaves nearly a third of Bournemouth's shares unaccounted for, though it has been reported that Chicago Bears minority investors, the Ryan family, Nuala Sarkar, who founded the investment group Cosmos, and the Hollywood actor Michael B. Jordan are all minority investors. Whilst there may be a lack of clarity as to the percentage breakdown of Bournemouth's ownership, there is no doubt about who calls the shots and has ultimate control. Bill Foley, who also owns the NHL franchise Vegas Golden Knights through Black Knight, has an estimated net worth of $2.7 billion, which has almost doubled since his investment group bought the club. Within a year of arriving on the South Coast, Foley outlined his ambition to take Bournemouth into Europe within the next 5 years. When he first arrived, however, the immediate task at hand was survival. Bournemouth made a slow start following the World Cup break, failing to win any of their next 7 matches and falling to the bottom of the Premier League table. But once impressive January arrivals like Dango Ouattara, Antoine Semenyo and Ilya Zabania settled in, after Foley sanctioned spending that the Mean had resisted, Bournemouth began picking up points again. A run of 6 wins from 9 saw Bournemouth survive, despite losing all of their last 4 games, but it wasn't enough to save Gary O'Neill's job. In a sacking that was considered extremely harsh by most people at the time, in light of the circumstances that O'Neill had inherited in his first job in management before keeping Bournemouth up, Bill Foley showed a ruthless side in axing him within 2 weeks of the season concluding. It wasn't the case that O'Neill was deemed to have done a poor job, that would be absurd, but rather that he had been brought in to do a specific job in terms of making Bournemouth tough to beat and keeping them in the league, and that with that job done, Foley and his team felt that there were more suitable candidates when it came to carrying out the next step in Bournemouth's journey, namely, establishing them in the top flight. Andoni Iraola was the man entrusted with carrying out Phase 2 of the Foley project, having won promotion and established Rayo Vallecano in La Liga during his last 3 years in Madrid, but Bournemouth went 9 games without a win until his ideas began to stick. A brilliant fullback, who spent almost his entire career playing for Athletic Club, Iraola won 7 caps for Spain, competing with the likes of Sergio Ramos, Juanfran and Alvaro Arbeloa, and just missing out on the country's 2010 World Cup winning squad. Iraola's time in the national team brought him into contact with the distinctive styles and ideas of both Luis Aragonés and Vicente del Bosque, and the highly technical tiki-taka style favoured by Spain and Barcelona at the time. Meanwhile, in the club game, he played some of his best football under Marcelo Bielsa at Athletic Club. Iraola, therefore, was influenced by the Spanish style, heavily possession-based, narrow, technical, and patient in their build-up, the Basque mentality, which is serious, collectivist, and rooted in hard work, as a child of Gipuzkoa and a product of the legendary Antehuaco honing ground, the specific Athletic Club approach to the game, which has tended to be more direct, a bit more physical, and focused on attacking from wide areas, and putting balls into the box in comparison to the Spanish style, as a graduate of Athletic's youth ranks who spent over 15 years at the club, and finally, the ideals of Bielsa ball, with its emphasis on work rate, pressing, stamina, intensity, fast transitions, and looking to overwhelm opponents by creating overloads in the final third. The result is a rich tapestry of teachings from which Iraola derives his own very individual style. Sometimes described as controlled chaos, though it is a term that Iraola himself rejects, Iraola has adopted the relentless pressing, particularly high up the pitch, of Bielsa, whilst also embracing the individualism and creative expression that made him fall in love with the sport. Iraola has described Michael Laudrup, one of the greatest dribblers of all time, as his idol, and waxed lyrical about his through balls to Romario for Barcelona in an interview with Miguel Delaney in The Independent. You see that in the freedom that is afforded to Bournemouth's advanced players, such as Antoine Semenyo, who received the ball on the edge of his own area at Anfield on the opening day of the season, proceeded to run virtually the entire length of the pitch, and fired the ball past a helpless Alisson to level the scores. In that sense, Iraola has also been presented as the antidote to Guardiola, and his highly positional football, which has come under increased scrutiny over the last couple of years, accused of stifling the individual and creative talents of players like Phil Foden, Cole Palmer, and Jack Grealish. Iraola encourages his players to think for themselves, often tailoring his training sessions as problem-solving exercises intended to replicate the unpredictable situations that can manifest themselves during games. Speaking to Michael Walker of The Athletic in February, Iraola stated, quote, "The game is for the players. Coaches are just the assistants. Coaches cannot pretend to control the game, luckily for the game. But I try to encourage this creativity, try not to limit touches in training, for example, try to encourage them to carry the ball, go 1-against-1, take risks. Because I think it's the easiest way to make a difference. You can organise patterns, but collectively, a lot of things have to go in synchronicity. Players going by their own can make a difference." End quote. This has the added benefit of making training sessions fresher and more enjoyable for players, which in turn makes them more engaged. Last season, after an ageing Man City team were run ragged at Dean Court, losing 2-1, Guardiola himself stated, quote, "Today, the modern football is the way that Bournemouth play." End quote. In addition to referencing Newcastle, Brighton, Liverpool's more athletic and less positional tactical approaches to the game. Iraola, for his part, has rejected the juxtaposition between himself and Guardiola, understandably, pointing to the success of Pep's approach to the game and stating that you just have to be, quote, "very, very, very good and have, quote, perfect timing in order to make it work." You also shouldn't be fooled into thinking that Iraola's tactics aren't carefully curated and meticulously considered. Bournemouth's pressing might appear frantic and chaotic at times, but in reality, it is a series of choreographed moves, often tailored to each individual opponent. The Cherries routinely keep their wingers narrow out of possession, clearing passing lanes for their opponents to play the ball into their fullbacks, and when they play that obvious ball, it isn't Bournemouth's wingers, typically, who will close them down, but their midfielders, as the whole team pushes up to isolate the opposition fullbacks and force them either to play a risky ball backwards, with Bournemouth's forwards still advanced, into midfield, where Tyler Adams usually will be snapping at their heels, or, as often happens, to hit the ball long, where Bournemouth centre-backs last season, 6'2" Ilya Zabani and 6'5" Dean Huijsen, tended to win their aerial duels and regain possession. It isn't exactly fail-safe. Bournemouth were the second worst team in the league last season in terms of aerial duels, and arguably the best way to play against them is to skip the press entirely, hit direct balls, win the first or second contacts, and then exploit the spaces in behind them. But it is fortunate for the Cherries in some ways that so few teams and managers are prepared to revert to what are deemed to be rudimentary tactics at this moment in time. Interestingly, aerial duels were statistically just about the weakest aspect of new Bournemouth centre-back Bafodé Diakite's game at Lille last season, despite being fairly dangerous from headers in the opposition box, and excellent in almost every other area of his game. But that may well be a consideration behind Bournemouth signing 18-year-old centre-back Veljko Milošević from Red Star Belgrade, who is already 6'4" and is renowned for his presence and aerial prowess. By the same token, however, Bournemouth weren't just the best team in the Premier League in terms of winning the ball back high at the pitch last season, they were the best in Europe, having won the ball back in the final third more times than any other team in Europe's Big Five leagues. They were also the most effective team in the Premier League at converting turnovers of possession into the final third into shots on goal, aided, of course, by the speed and directness of the likes of Semenyo, Ouattara, Kluivert and Evan Nielsen. There isn't time to break down the entire Bournemouth squad player by player, which is a shame because I did in my notes, but for all of the losses this summer, and Dominic Solanke last summer, it could well be argued that Bournemouth's most prized assets have been retained. Ryan Christie, for example, rarely takes the headlines. He has only scored 8 goals in 150 appearances for the Cherries, a seemingly underwhelming tally for someone who has at times been deployed in either attacking midfield or on the right wing, but there is a reason why Iraola has described him as being the most important player in his team, and why he picked up 2 awards, including the Supporters Player of the Season award, at Bournemouth's end-of-season awards last season. Iraola has said of the Scottish midfielder, quote, "He is the most tactically intuitive player I have in the squad. He knows what's going on at all times." End quote. When Iraola was able to turn around a slow start at Bournemouth, that was thanks in large part to how quickly Christie was able to be his brain on the pitch. Iraola may have emphasised how coaches can't control games, unfortunately so, as he put it, but fortunately for him, Ryan Christie often can. Pivotal to Bournemouth's intense press and choreographed movements, he's also incisive and penetrative in his passing. Age 30, it is easy to see why Christie has avoided big money offers and Big Six interest, but had he stayed fit for all of last season, instead of missing double-digit league games with ongoing groin problems, it is perfectly feasible that Bournemouth could have qualified for Europe. Then there's Antoine Semenyo, born in London but a Ghana international since 2022, who was signed in Foley's first window owning the club for £10 million from Bristol City. Another major beneficiary of the Iraola revolution, Semenyo has yet to really get going under Gary O'Neill, but he has gone from strength to strength in a Bournemouth setup that fully maximises his speed and willingness to run towards goal. Last season, despite being a standout performer and hitting double figures for the first time in his career to date, Semenyo could be quite wasteful. That's not so much a criticism as a recognition of the fact that if he can be more clinical and make better decisions in the final third, he could be absolutely terrifying this season. He's already made 1 assist and scored 2 goals in Bournemouth's opening 3 games, both of those goals coming at Anfield. I think that he is arguably better than anyone that Man United have spent a combined €250 million on this summer, and I don't say that just to be provocative. And I think that he should be aiming to have a season where he breaks away from being just one of a handful of very good wingers in the Premier League and becomes one who features in the top 10 of the scoring charts and that we're talking about on a weekly basis. Speaking of occasionally wasteful but truly frightening potential, Evanilson scored 10 goals in the Premier League last season in what was considered an acceptable debut campaign for Bournemouth's club record signing. Brought in from Porto for more than £40 million, there were reports last season that Bournemouth staff could forgive Evanilson's lack of goals on account of his superb pressing, work rate, and all-round game. All of that is true, but it is just worth adding that Evanilson missed several games with a broken foot last season and only played 2 full 90s before March. He averaged a goal contribution once every 156 minutes when on the pitch, which, theoretically, is over 20 goal contributions over a full season. Bearing in mind that was his first season in the Premier League, coming from a league where several centre-forwards have struggled to make an instant impact and adapt in the past, and he is still only 25 years old, I think that he can be a real force of nature if or when everything starts to click. Absenteeism was perhaps the biggest problem for Bournemouth last season, as 9 or 10 key players suffered extended spells on the sidelines, which can be an occupational hazard and a worthwhile trade-off of playing and training with such high intensity. And last but not least, in fact, most importantly of all, Bournemouth have tied Andoni Iraola down on a new 2-year deal. I am not being hyperbolic when I say that I think Iraola is among the best managers in the world, and, again, equally importantly, he is someone who tends to see out his contracts. Iraola rejected the advances of Leeds United, then of the Premier League, after a delegation from the West Yorkshire club flew out to meet him in Madrid 2.5 years ago, because he wanted to see out his commitment to Rayo Vallecano. Iraola's impact at Bournemouth was swift, and the speed with which he is able to fully integrate players into what can be quite a complex system is remarkable. Fluent in English, partly due to spending the final year of his career playing alongside the likes of Frank Lampard and Andrea Pirlo for New York City FC in the United States, where they speak a variation of English, Iraola is also obviously fluent in Spanish and can understand basic Italian and Portuguese. He has a wonderful ability to simplify complex ideas and effectively communicate them, exhibited, on numerous occasions, in tactical discussions with him that you can watch freely online. Part of his willingness to stay on, no doubt, despite reported interest from several bigger clubs, is the result of Bill Foley's backing, ambition, and outstanding track record in terms of recruitment. Whilst Maxime Demine invested a reported £187 million in Bournemouth over 11 years, a sensational amount of money, don't get things twisted, Foley has very nearly eclipsed that in only 3. The American, through BKFC, has injected £177 million into Bournemouth in less than 3 years, which is the 6th most owner funding of any Premier League club during that time, ahead of Man United, Liverpool, and Arsenal. Spending money is all well and good, of course, but as, say, the Farhad Moshiri era at Everton illustrates, how and where you spend it can be just as important. Bournemouth's recruitment since Foley arrived hasn't been flawless, mistakes have been made here and there, but the overall picture is superb. Bournemouth's recruitment could best be described as being data-informed rather than data-led, as is the case at Brentford or Brighton, through licensed analytics platforms as opposed to their own in-house software, and combined with more traditional scouting methods. There is a sharp focus on youth, as Bournemouth search for value in players or markets that may be otherwise overlooked. Last season, the Cherries had the 4th youngest average 11 in the Premier League, and none of their 7 new signings this summer, including goalkeeper George Petrovic and AC Milan loanee Alex Jimenez, are over the age of 25. It's a model which has served Bournemouth well, not only supplying Andoni Iraola with players who are young, hungry, and fit enough to press with the intensity that he demands for 90 minutes, but also, due to their age and lower profile, they often command lower wages. Bournemouth's wage bill, as of their last set of fully published accounts for the 2023-24 season, were the 6th lowest in the Premier League, just 1/3 of the size of Manchester United's, who they finished 14 points and 6 places above last season. The more traditional scouting element of Bournemouth's recruitment is aided by their eyes and ears on the ground across multiple leagues, continents, and fundamentally markets. Bill Foley has established a multi-club ownership model since buying the Cherries, which has seemingly now become the dystopian norm at almost every Premier League club. BKFC own majority or minority stakes in New Zealand-based A-League side Auckland FC, League and Club Lorient, Scottish Premiership outfit Hibs, and Portuguese Primeira Liga club Vitória de Guimarães. This week, it was announced that Foley was also in talks to acquire a minority 25% stake in the reigning Croatian champions HNK Rijeka. Bournemouth, meanwhile, also have strategic partnerships with Kyoto Sanga in Japan and Orlando City in the United States, with whom they reportedly pool scouting resources and information, taking the total number of clubs within the Foley universe up to 7, with an 8th soon to join. In addition to shared knowledge and resources, there have been direct transfers between Foley-owned clubs. Dango Ouattara, Foley's first signing at Dean Court, joined Bournemouth from Lorient, with Roman Favre later heading on loan in the opposite direction. Attacking midfielder Emiliano Marcondes, meanwhile, joined Hibs on loan from Bournemouth, and Alex Paulson, a young goalkeeper brought to Bournemouth from New Zealand, spent last season on loan at fellow Foley-owned club Auckland FC. Bournemouth's technical director since 2014, heavily involved in recruitment decisions, was Richard Hughes, who was poached by Liverpool last summer, where he has since been lauded for overseeing a major overhaul and unprecedented spending at Anfield in the window just gone. That might seem like a major blow, and perhaps it is, but Thiago Pinto, the man who replaced Hughes at Bournemouth, having previously been a director at both Roma and Benfica, began his reign by spearheading Dean Huijsen's move to the club, despite immense competition. It would be fair to say then that he got off to a decent start. Bournemouth, going back a good few years but especially under Iraola, have carved out a reputation for themselves as being excellent developers of talent and as a club that is willing to provide young players with opportunities and a platform to impress. Young players, and their agents, look at the likes of Milos Kerkez and Dean Huijsen, now at Liverpool and Real Madrid, and see a pathway at Bournemouth to fast-track their careers. That's why the Cherries are sometimes able to beat the big boys to signings, even sometimes on lower wages, but with the incentive of first-team opportunities. It creates a virtuous cycle where players know they're getting a pathway to first-team football at superclubs if they are adequately impressive, and Bournemouth know that they are getting a self-selected pool of some of the hungriest, most talented, and most ambitious young players available, who buy into their style and ideas, and who aren't just content to rot on a super club's bench while collecting huge wages. In Foley's first 3 transfer windows, Bournemouth raised close to zero profit via player sales. Across their first 2 seasons back in the Premier League, Ben Pearson was the only player to leave Bournemouth for a fee whatsoever when he joined Stoke City, and even that was an undisclosed fee reported to be negligible, perhaps less than £1 million. In Foley's 4th window, Dominic Solanke was sold for a club record £55 million, rising to £65 million subject to add-ons, but even then, he was the only significant departure. The logic, reportedly, as far as Foley was concerned, was that Bournemouth would fight tooth and nail to keep their best players while Premier League survival was at stake, because no sale was more valuable than that, and only now that Bournemouth feel a degree of ease and comfort about their top-flight status has the club sanctioned several high-profile sales. Even then, they have secured maximum value. They were powerless to prevent Dean Huijsen from leaving, with several clubs willing to meet his £50 million release clause. The Spanish international picked Real Madrid, turning Bournemouth £37 million of profit in the space of 12 months. Ilya Zabarnye's departure was a painful one, since it robbed Bournemouth of their 2 outstanding centre-backs, but the almost £60 million that PSG paid for him is the most that any defender in the world was bought or sold for this summer. In fact, of the 4 most expensive defenders signed in world football this season, 3 of them, Huijsen, Zabarnye and Kerkez, were all bought from Bournemouth. Dango Ouattara, meanwhile, undoubtedly a player of enormous talent, but one who didn't get in Andoni Iraola's strongest 11 when everyone was fit, was sold to Brentford for a club record £42.5 million. They are all very good players, who will be greatly missed, to varying degrees at Bournemouth, but no one can doubt that they have maximised value. Only Chelsea and Aston Villa have raised more money through player sales over the last 2 seasons, at over £260 million, and only Villa and Brentford have a greater positive net spend. Iraola has also never worked at a club with better facilities, albeit only as of 4 months ago, when the Cherries moved to their new state-of-the-art training ground on the former site of Canford Magna Golf Club, 20 to 25 minutes outside of Bournemouth city centre. Built at a cost of £32 million on a 57-acre site, that is cheap in comparison to Tottenham or Leicester City's more than £100 million facilities, yet they are at least as impressive as pretty much anything outside of the Big Six. Construction began under Maxime Demin's ownership in 2019, and the new performance centre will host Bournemouth men's, women's and all of their youth teams, boasting 16 pitches, changing rooms, classrooms, media suites, medical facilities, and a canteen serving free lunches. Jim Ratcliffe would be fuming, but at the end of the day, you can't expect young upstarts like Manchester United to be able to rival the level of generosity at a true super club like Bournemouth. Now attention has turned to the stadium. Dean Court, currently known as the Vitality Stadium for sponsorship reasons, has been Bournemouth's home since 1910, but the stadium was entirely rebuilt in 2001 as a 3-sided ground, with a 4th side added in 2005. At the time, few could have predicted that Bournemouth would require a stadium larger than its 11,307 capacity. Not since the early 1970s, when the club was rebranded, had they averaged in excess of 10,000 fans at their home games, and by the late 90s and early 2000s, when the stadium was rebuilt, they had slipped below 5,000. Dean Court has now operated at maximum capacity for a decade, but plans are in place to both expand and carry out major upgrades on the ground. Enabling works are expected to be completed this season, which will include a minor capacity expansion and internal refurbishments, but the focus, as the name suggests, will be getting the stadium ready or enabled for the more significant stages of the project. Phase 1, scheduled for August 2026, which will include completely rebuilding the stadium's south stand and filling in the corners of the ground with seats, will increase the capacity by more than 6,000, up to 17,296, and Phase 2, scheduled for August 2027, will see expanded north and east stands, taking the finished capacity up to just shy of 2,200. That might not seem massive, and by Premier League standards it isn't, but Bournemouth is a city of 200,000 people, Dorset is a county of fewer than 400,000, and Bournemouth have historically had a small but loyal fan base. Building a 30 to 40,000 seater stadium, therefore, which would rarely be filled, would be nonsensical. Whilst the stadium's overall capacity is only doubling, with the word only in inverted commas there, the hospitality capacity is expected to expand by a multiple of 5, up from a capacity of around 700 to close to 3,500. Hospitality seats are by far the most profitable areas of every Premier League stadium, and Bournemouth plan to appeal to the affluent football fans and companies in Dorset in order to punch above their weight. Fulham, for example, had the same matchday revenue as Everton at Goodison Park and higher than Nottingham Forest, despite having a much smaller capacity and average attendance. Bournemouth currently have the lowest matchday revenue in the Premier League, below Burnley and Brentford's, about half of Crystal Palace's, and a quarter of Brighton's, but with a new restaurant and plush corporate facilities, they'll expect to be much more competitive. Bournemouth's entertaining football has also helped to grow their broadcast revenue. Of the Premier League's domestic broadcast deal, 25% is redistributed based upon the number of games that each team has televised. Bournemouth was selected for TV 17 times last season, which is more than Brentford, Brighton or Everton, and given some of the thrilling Bournemouth games that the Sky Sports and TNT Sport cameras missed, you'd expect that to be even higher still this season. There is a great urgency about everything at Bournemouth, partly because Bill Foley, in his own words, doesn't have long. The American is 80 years old, and by the end of his 5-year plan to qualify for Europe, set out in 2023, he will be 83. Right now, the Cherries sit 7th though. They are the same odds with some bookies to be relegated this season as Man City, and you wouldn't bet against Andoni Iraola, delivering European football ahead of schedule. Following a summer window in which Bournemouth had the most positive net spend in all of world football, generating over €100 million net, all while having a lower wage bill than either Wolves or West Ham, and moving into a training ground that would be the envy of most teams in the league, that is nothing short of remarkable. There are aspects of Bournemouth's rise, the cash injections, FFP breach, and multi-club ownership model, which aren't especially romantic. But in terms of competence, and what they have achieved with third or fourth tier history, infrastructure and support, they are among the best run clubs in the world. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much, as ever, for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed today's video or found it remotely interesting or informative, and as always, I really do mean even if only remotely, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on, both for this channel, HITC Sevens, but also my second channel, Alfie Potsama, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with a couple of videos that you might enjoy watching after this one. You can also find me on social media, typically via the username at HITC Sevens, and you can now support me additionally, should you wish to do so, either via the Alfie Potsama YouTube channel, where you can become a channel member, or via buymeacoffee.com/Alfie Potsama, where you can do the same thing, but Google won't take 30% of it, and I am reliably informed that they don't need it. They're doing pretty well, actually, as it goes. Yeah, pretty strong fundamentals there. But yeah, anyway, do all of those things if you want to, don't if you don't. I love you all. I shall see you shortly. Take care out there. Cheers.